Welcome to Pathway to Property, your go-to podcast for building a property portfolio and breaking down property markets.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pathway to Property podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Lachlan Vidler, Director of Atlas Property Group, and I'm joined by my co-host, Luke Clifford, and Senior Investment Consultant at Atlas Property Group.
Just throwing the senior in there.
The Senior.
I love you, mate. Thank you.
How are you, mate? How are you feeling?
Mate,
Truthfully, because there's a real answer here.
Truthfully, mate, I am in the wars.
Tell everyone about it.
I think start of 2025, just like everybody, had a New Year's resolution, which was to get back in shape and get back into soccer.
You're not in bad shape. Not in bad shape.
I've been in much better form. But had the New Year's resolution to kind of get back into soccer because I've taken about the last year and a half off. So, and I've also kind of let myself go a little bit, just a touch.
Couple of wicked wings.
Yeah, just a couple. But so kind of was getting back into fitness. I was going to the park. I was going for my runs. And then I joined five-a-side soccer. And
how many injuries have it? Mate, you're getting old now as well.
I'm getting old.
You're plus 30.
Once you pass 30, mate, your body just becomes more and more delicate. And anyway, had the first game back, scored a double hat-trick, mind you. We won 7-3. But the last minute of the game, the Achilles completely ruptured, completely went on me. So
now, I mean, I have seen the photo of your foot, and it was black and blue.
It was
by very definition. It was
McBuckled.
It was McBuckled, was it?
Yeah, no,
mate,
not fun,
good.
mate. Not fun. So I'm in this boot for another 6 weeks at least, and then
it's another 6.
Yeah,
oh man,
another 6, and then plenty of physio after that. So
man,
I don't know if that's time for me to call it a day with the soccer career.
Oh, I mean, how many almost there athletes have there been and just one injury?
Keep rubbing it in, man. Keep rubbing it in.
That's right. I have my knee. You got your Achilles, right? We've all got our thing. But, mate, look, it's a bit rough, but I know you'll get through it, right?
We'll get through it.
I'll just keep flogging the whip.
Yeah.
Cracking the
along.
whip, sorry.
Feel like I'm an extra in like Private Ryan or something like that, just getting through, but we'll be okay.
Well, I'm glad that at least you know, the mouth's working, the brain's working. You're turning it over pretty well. You've been prepping for this episode pretty hard because we've got a pretty good one coming up.
We do.
Right.
We got the big juicy episode.
Another big juicy episode, I think, is a better way to describe it because, Lukey, they're all big juicy episodes.
True. That is true.
But today we're going to be unpacking some of the macro factors that impact the property market. So I think there's a chunk for us to go through, and I think probably quite disappointingly, and I'll say it from the outset, we just don't have enough time to go through all the different things that I and we consider as macro factors. But I think we got some, to use your words, some pretty juicy ones to unpack today.
We do indeed. So do you want to kind of run everybody through what we're going to be covering today, or how are you thinking that we should structure it?
Well, I mean, we'll give everyone a bit of a run through, but I think before we dive in, I want to just, I guess, give everyone a bit of an update on sort of how the podcast is going and also, you know, like what we're kind of seeing around the place from a markets point of view. So, I mean, in terms of the podcast, man, I reckon it's been pretty crazy, and you've been seeing this as well. The amount of people who have listened, especially over that Christmas break, has been insane. I mean, I reckon we must be getting, 10, 15 inquiries a day almost. Just through our website from people listening on the podcast. So big shout out to everyone. We've loved it. We really appreciate it. Obviously helping a ton of people start or continue building their portfolio through it. But I think more than anything, it's just fun chatting to people about property. And maybe you can, I don't know if you have any stories of people that you've chatted to about it, but just the people who come through as well. And then, you know, they're kind of looking to see if they can do something, but they also we just have a bit of a yarn about, you know, the podcast and property and stuff like.
Yeah. Like most of the time when I speak to people, it's like they're either, you know, going for a drive or they're at the gym and they're just tuning in, and then they end up getting hooked on it, and they go through the whole episode. And obviously, we've only recorded 3 of the Pathway to Property podcast so far. This is the 4th. But yeah, the feedback's been really, really positive.
Absolutely. I think it's been, honestly, way more than I ever could have expected. And this episode will come out So, I mean, we're doing this in the first couple of days of Feb. It'll probably come out in a week or two, I think. I think I've got an SPI show as well this month. So I think feeding into that second thing before we jump into the episode around sort of what we're seeing, people are really serious about starting to take action in 25. Like, and I think especially the people that are serious about doing something, those people are jumping in. And I mean, we saw awesome inflation data come out last month. I mean, it of course it could have been better, but I think in terms of what did happen, I thought it was great. It really sort of showcased the idea that rates are going to cut quite shortly, or there's going to be a rate cut quite soon. Not the best English there, but you know, I just think it's really interesting to see, and it's something we're going to talk about today. Sentiment, just crazy to see that, you know, like property is a really emotional thing, and everyone tries to strip emotion out of it. But the reality is that you know, the really professional investors and sophisticated investors, like, to be honest, probably a lot of the listeners of this, they're always in the market. You know, they're not really turned off by headlines, but that's such a small proportion, you know, and it's not massive. But then the people who are the sort of very much like regular mum and dad investors, they love to see things that are changing sentiment, like inflation data coming down, like then knowing the fact that like rates are probably going to be cut imminently. And it gives them that confidence to be going, well, I can now jump in because I feel like things are going to move. And again, to be talked about a bit later, but that sentiment has such a massive impact on property market performance, because calling a spade, if we have a rate cut in Feb, so in a few weeks' time, and it goes down 25 basis points, it's not going to really change that many people's borrowing, right? Like, let me rephrase that. It'll change everybody's borrowing, but it's not going to change it by some substantial amount like what people think it will, because like 25 basis points, I mean, I'm sure a mortgage broker out there might fact check me on this one, but I'd say for most people, talking maybe like 25 to 40 grand sort of at most as a change. So if you can't buy a property, odds are you probably still can't buy a property, but the thing is going to be that sentiment. So lots happening, I think is what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout way. Property markets are going crazy, deals happening left, right, and center. It's busy, and people who are serious are diving in.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of what I'm hearing as well. Like, we get a lot of people coming through the doors, and they're kind of sitting on the outskirts at the moment thinking, oh, you know, what's happening with the rate cuts and things like that. So with that inflation data that you mentioned that came out, like, is it going to impact borrowing that much? Is it going to impact repayments significantly? Probably not. But that sentiment, that psychological shift, that's probably where we're going to see, you know, some of the biggest movements.
Well, here's a question to put you on the spot.
Hit me.
You talk with a lot of people who aren't yet clients of ours at Atlas Property Group.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer, so don't throw me under the bus. But of course, you'll speak honestly to everyone. Do you feel like there's a bit of an energy shift? Like, people you're talking to are like more excited?
I think so. I think it's more of an urgency. Like, people understand that, you know, once rates do drop and people just psychologically shift a little bit, maybe they think they can get their hands on a little bit more finance, they believe more people are just going to organically start to enter the market, and they want to capture that really nice kind of sugar hit, I guess, to the market, right? Like,
I reckon I really like the way you said that. Maybe that's probably more what I meant. Not, I guess excitement still, but I like the way you phrase that around urgency, because I think that it's so true. The amount of people, like the amount of our clients I talk to who, you know, when they sign on with us, like, we obviously have a process. Like, we're there to help them build out a portfolio plan, and we're there to obviously help them then, you know, identify the right areas so that we can then go and, you know, look at them, and they've got to look at that information and tell us that they're happy with those areas and things like that. The amount of people who are like, let's go, come on, hurry up. Like, we got to get going. And where they're going, it's all right. Like, we understand what's going on. Like, we're going to be the voice of reason here. I think urgency. Yeah. I love it. I think you're so right.
And it's interesting because, like, I remember speaking to clients, you know, 8 months ago, 12 months ago, which they were kind of on the border. They were kind of like, look, I just really want to see what's going to happen with interest rates. Like, if interest rates do start to pull back, I'll definitely start to get into the market. But we haven't seen a massive drop over the last 6 to 12 months. So these people, they're probably still on the sidelines,
100%.
not having made a call on
100%. Come on, we both know, and we've obviously got to dive into what we need to talk about. But we both know, you and I have been doing this long enough, and I'm sure most people listening can think of the context in their jobs. There are a lot of people that are gunners. I'm going to invest when this happens. I'm going to do this when this happens. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
But it's always that they're looking for a reason on why not to. So it's always I'm waiting for this next thing, i.e. 8 months, 12 months ago, I'm going to invest when rates drop, whatever. And now when rates drop, it'll be, I'm just going to see how far they go.
Yeah.
I
think like when we talk about this, like we always talk about like action takers versus people that are kind of on the sidelines or info gatherers. But I think a lot of people probably think that this is more like a sales tactic to try to get people in, but it's genuinely the longer that you're on the outskirts, 100%. Not making a decision, you're missing out. 100%. You're genuinely missing out on all that growth that you could be capturing, building that equity up. But now, because you've waited the 8 months, you have to now rely on your savings for that deposit if you're getting into the first one.
I mean, we've had a client who we've bought 3 properties for in within the last 12 months. And that bloke, I reckon, I don't actually know the number, but I reckon he would have made, 250,000 in equity, something like that in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
And I remember, I can't remember if I told the story because obviously I do a lot of podcasts. I can't remember if I told the story on this one or a different one, but I was actually talking about him recently. I think it was on one of the other ones that I do, the Property Investment Australia podcast. And I was telling the story that like this guy was so dedicated. He was such an action taker, like such a bias for action. But I remember when he came to us, we built his portfolio plan. We worked out how to get him to his cash flow goal in about 10 years or something, maybe 15 years. And part of that review was we said to him, man, like we can't tell you to sell this property because Murphy's Law says the minute we tell you to sell that property, it somehow booms, right?
Fundamentally
like,
shifts.
Literally, like even though it was not a great property, like he'd probably be happy with me saying it was a pretty shit property. It served a purpose for him, but it was not that great. And he knew he read between the lines. He literally went out and he sold it at the earliest opportunity that he could, so that we could then go and buy more and more properties.
Repurpose those
literally.
funds.
But like talk about an action taker. Like within the last 12 months, he's bought 3 properties and sold 1 just so that he could make the right actions or take the right actions. So you're right. Definitely not a sales tactic. I mean, God, don't call us. Don't listen to our podcast. Don't do any of that. Like it's all good. It's all sweet. We're not here to beg for your listenership or your business or anything like that. We literally just want to help people, and like, I think it's just crazy how many people sit back with the, like, it's who was it? Was it Edison or Einstein? One of the two. I think it was Thomas Edison. I can't remember, one of them. But the whole idea of the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And like the amount of people, I feel like maybe we've both got a bit of energy about us because it's the start of the year and like we're ripping into it.
Yeah.
The amount of people who just think like suddenly their life is going to change by doing nothing and waiting further or waiting for something else. Oh man, blows my mind.
Well, mate, I know we love a yarn, and I always say that you can
tell me to get back on track, aren't you?
You can talk underwater, mate. The amount of podcasts that you do, but I think jumping in, like we're looking at those macro level factors, right? So today we're covering 4 big ones. So the first one is credit access.
Yep.
The second one, sentiment.
Yep.
Third one, government policy across local, state, and federal levels.
Yep.
And then the last one, infrastructure. Right. So I think
big jobs today.
Big jobs. So I guess to kick us off, let's talk on credit access to begin with.
All right. I love how you just pushed me along. You just said, shut up and get back on track. Well, credit access. I mean, so I guess just to give one little bit of context to everyone. So when we're talking about the macro factors today, and even in general, right? Macro is the big picture. And in previous episodes, we've broken down some other factors that are really important in property. But the reason we really wanted to break down the macro factors is because you have less control over the macro, and to an extent, they can have less of an impact, but it can also have a much broader impact. And it's also things that can have a much longer time frame to have an impact, positive or negative. But these are sort of the bigger picture things. And from that list, I'm sure everyone's sort of been able to pick up what I mean by bigger picture items. So it's just really important to understand these, because also a lot of them, they don't work, in isolation, and they can also be the same conditions that then have different impacts in different places, right? So that's one thing I really want to say from the start. But credit access, I think this one is like, if you gave me a 25 words or less, right? The 25 words or less I give is the greater access to money, the more demand. Right? So when we're talking about credit access, what we're talking about is fundamentally how easy is it for people to be able to borrow money, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, pretty much everybody in Australia, especially investors, buy investment properties with debt. So if it's easier to get money, i.e. the banks are throwing it away.
Yeah, if they're giving out loans like Oprah used to give out cars.
Yeah, you get a loan. You get a loan.
Yeah, you get a
Everyone,
loan.
wait, look below your seat, Luke. I won't do that. You probably can't move with your leg, but yeah, literally, right?
Yeah.
So if money is easy to get, right? Think cheap, right? If cheap and easy to get, naturally, more people are going to take it up, right?
Of course.
So if there's more money getting around, it means that there is going to be more demand, because people are then going to want to go spend that money on stuff, right?
Yeah.
The smart people, they invest.
Yeah.
The less smart people, they buy jet skis, right? Before investing. Jet skis come after investing, right? So anyone who has a jet ski that's invested, don't come for me on that one, right? But it's about using the money, in a smart and intelligent manner, right? So by extension, higher rates means less access, and it means less demand. And I can give you two really simple reasons for that, right? Sorry, not two simple reasons, two simple examples, right? So the first one is the rate itself, right? So the higher the repayment, naturally, the more money you're going to have to spend. And if you're not getting enough of a return from your properties, then that's a gap that gets bigger and bigger each week, fortnight, month in terms of your expenses. So for a lot of people, they just literally wouldn't be able to afford it, right? So thanks to good old APRA, we've got something, they come in and they basically change the way people are assessed on their borrowing, right? So just because your loan is at 6% doesn't mean you're getting assessed at 6%, right? So for most people, they go and add in a buffer on top, and basically that buffer means that some people, especially over the last 12 to 18 months, may have been getting assessed on a rate as high as like 9 or 10%, which means naturally, even if you could afford your 6%, you can't, you might not have been able to afford that 10%, right?
Yeah.
Or more importantly, you could only afford less. So less access means less demand, right? I mean, you've seen that, right? Like when you're chatting with people and, clients or potential clients, like you've seen how many people get impacted by that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think APRA, when they come in hard and they want to be the fun police, and
the fun police,
they start tightening lending restrictions. We definitely see that. And I think a classic example was I think it was 2017 when APRA kind of put their foot down a little bit on lending restrictions, and people weren't able to access equity as efficiently, and markets like Sydney and Melbourne did they went through a little bit of a stabilization period, maybe even a dip in some markets. Whereas what we saw in 2020 when those COVID days, right? Yeah. Money was so cheap for people to get their hands on.
100%. I mean, but you can see that at different times. In the early 2010s, APRA made changes. APRA then made changes in I think it was 21, when they increased the buffer rate from 2.5 to 3%.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're right. Like you can see all those changes and sort of how it goes. And I think that for a lot of people, especially people who are really trying to build an investment portfolio, they're comfortable with a lot of risk, not with a lot of risk, with the concept of risk in property investing.
Yeah.
And, they're then getting hamstrung, and they're going guys, I'm happy. I'll take this risk on. It's all good. But, obviously APRA, it's one of the reasons we've got one of the most stable housing markets in the world is because of these restrictions. So to play devil's advocate, right, it's obviously really important as well, because it keeps that it keeps the foundation strong, basically, But I think the last thing I want to say on credit access was It also then goes and it impacts the build sector, right, or the development sector. And the reason for that is when rates are higher, it then also becomes really hard to make property developments or property projects stack up because obviously when you go to do something like that, you build in a margin of error because you know that you're going to have costs that you don't expect.
Yeah,
exactly right. But when the rates are higher, that starts to get stripped out, and that's why we've seen for the last little while, it's been really hard for people to get projects off the ground. And I guess the flip side out of that is we're in a housing crisis. The government's setting these standards, the building accords of what they wanted to get built. We need more property, but developers don't want to do it. And it makes it really hard to then fix some of our fundamental issues around the housing crisis because people won't build. It's just like, and we've seen like how many builders have gone bust, especially over the last 6 to 12 months. And it's because margins were already wafer thin in a lot of circumstances. Add in higher rates, add in higher repayments, costs, all that. Suddenly, that impacts the supply side, which then in turn means demand continues to outstrip it even more. So
this next point that we're talking about, sentiment, it does flow into a lot of the different factors that we're speaking about today. So I think sentiment it's a really kind of interesting one. It's hard to measure sometimes. It's like this, invisible force, which either, it makes people either really, really froth over property investing or other people kind of have that fear and they just kind of, stay on the outskirts or maybe even sell their property.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a really, really interesting one. I think as you mentioned before with APRA, like if they're, adjusting lending policy and things like that and the assessment rates and whatnot, if interest rates are lower and, people can get their hands on money, people are naturally going to feel more aggressive when they want to get into property, and 100%. Then the opposite on the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
So I guess what are your thoughts on sentiment in general?
I think that sentiment is one of the biggest reasons why people will probably forever struggle to break down and create an equation for how growth in property markets works. It's one of the reasons why, it's impossible to 100% know what goes on because obviously there's lots of other factors at play, but that's the emotional human element of it. And people are irrational beings, and like what we were talking about before, right? Like there's realistically been not that much of a change in a lot of circumstances and conditions over the last, say, 12 months. And yet now, because we've been edging closer and closer to the rates dropping, people now feel more comfortable, right? But for most people, the banks were already going to loan them that same amount of money, stress tested at much higher than what it actually is.
Yeah.
We've been pretty confident for quite a long time that it also was not going to go any further up. So you'd say that a rational being at that point would have said, well, 6 months ago, I was in the same position as today.
Yeah.
And then when rates were going to drop around now, 6 months ago, when you think about it, well, I could have just been in the market earlier and I still would have got the impact if I took a variable rate mortgage as starting now, right? But we're irrational beings.
It's so interesting, right? Because it's like, mate, when these rates eventually do drop, like a lot of these people that have this kind of mindset where it's like, okay, this is the time to get in now because, more people are going to flood the market, but you're going to obviously have more competition as well. So
don't even get me started.
Yeah, they're going to have more competition. So all these people that were kind of looking at this like 3, 6, 12 months ago, they had the foresight that this was likely going to come to fruition.
Yeah.
Get in earlier and then just watch that growth come as those rates inevitably start to pull down slightly.
But I think that's the thing, right? Is that the best investors, the ones that have the best results, and honestly, the best luck, because it looks like luck, but it's not really. They're the ones that are able to do the best they can, and no one can ever do it 100%. But they can take their irrationality and put it in a box and lock it away, right? And they let their rational thoughts take over, like there was nothing wrong with doing it 6 months ago or 12 months ago.
Yeah.
And like you said, now when people are coming in, and this is not to dissuade people, right? Like it's I would say it's still just as critical to start now because it's only going to keep getting worse, right? But for somebody who was sitting on the fence 6 months ago, I would say that they've made a worse decision by starting now compared to 6 months ago, right? Not even for like performance they could have had or anything like that, just for the pure fact that like you are going to face more competition.
Yeah.
That is going to drive prices more rapidly. So you're going to get a worse deal, right? But, now we're in the position, well, it's the old saying, right? Like the best time to start was yesterday and the second best time is today. So for those people, I'd say don't let it wait any further. And if you were somebody who wasn't in a position to start 6 months ago, definitely don't be one of those people listening back to this podcast in another 6 months saying, oh man, I should have just started. Like it just sets you up for failure, right? So, but we're talking about sentiment, right? And we're talking about it as this sort of like invisible force, and to an extent it is. But we also can do certain things to try and measure it, right? And by we, I definitely don't mean Atlas. That is well outside our remit. But there are different, groups out there that do their best to kind of inform sentiment. So one of the biggest ones is the Westpac Melbourne Institute Sentiment Index. So it's a collaboration between those two groups. And if you haven't had a look at the sentiment index, I would highly recommend you go and look at it, right? Every month it comes out, you can get it for free, and they give a whole breakdown, and they also unpack the index across generally, like how are people feeling, like what's the sentiment overall. But then they also go and do things like breaking it down into different buckets of things and different questions about stuff. So, it could be about housing, it could be about groceries, it could be about holidaying, it could be about like, how you feel about your financial security. Like they do all these different things, which then combines into the overall number. And the latest index is really interesting, and I actually think it makes a lot of sense. So, unfortunately, as we're recording this, we don't have the Feb index, right? Because we're just a little bit too early into Feb for it to be released. But we've got the January one, and interestingly, in the few months prior, around sort of January, December, and I can't remember if it actually was November as well, but sort of the last few months preceding it, there has been a little bit of a dip in sentiment. And I think that makes a lot of sense because, like, the cost of living pressures that the average person has been facing has just continued to develop and develop and develop. And I think that for a lot of people, then running into sort of Christmas, you want to spend money on your kids or your family and things like that. I can imagine there was a lot of stress. But my expectation is that when we see the Feb data, I don't know when they collect the data though, so potentially not Feb, but I think definitely March, and then probably starting to move from March onwards. I think that we're going to see a big increase in it, right? Massive.
For sure.
Because we got inflation coming down. We're likely to have rate drops coming in very, very shortly. I had a look before we came here on the 31st of Jan. The market had a rate cut for the Feb meeting priced in at 95%. Yeah. So we'll see if that happens. But talking about sentiment, there you go, right? 95% of the market, right, or as of the 31st of Jan, was saying we expect there to be a drop, right? So I'm sure everyone can obviously start to piece that together and go, I think that the sentiment index as a measure, let alone just the actual feeling out in society and the world and property markets, I think we're going to start to see it shift quite a lot. But I'll finish by saying it wasn't that low, like it's not the highest it's ever been by any stretch. But when I said there was a little dip, it's still been at a pretty solid enough level that, people aren't, they're not super depressed around the place about where things are at, basically. Yeah. So anyway, that's sentiment. Yeah. That's sentiment for you.
Very, very good, mate. Very good. And then I think kind of shifting gears a little bit, just mindful of time.
Yeah, I'm here trying to read the watch to work out how long we've been going. We need a digital timer in the corner.
We do.
Here.
I think we do. So next thing that we want to talk about is government policy. So we want to talk on this at three different levels, effectively. So local, state, and federal. So really, really interesting. And I think the other one to throw in there potentially is international political factors as well at play. That could impact markets.
Is that a can of worms you want to open?
Oh, I'm not sure. I guess to kick us off, mate, do you want to start off with, let's go from the top down at a federal level?
Well, I think starting at the very, very beginning of it, I think government policy is really interesting because it can have some of the biggest impacts on both the supply side and the demand side.
Yeah.
Where some other factors typically are more associated with one side of that coin, right? Like I would say sentiment is far more towards the demand side, right? Like, of course, it can have an impact on supply because if sentiment's really high, people might be selling, right? But I think that's predominantly one side of the coin, right? Government policy can impact all sides of it, and like you said, at all levels: federal, state, local, and potentially even international factors too. So, I think that starting at the federal level. There are more things we can possibly cover here. More things than we can possibly cover. But
negative gearing, capital gains tax.
I was going to say, I think going, like if we talk broadly, right, you're talking about tax, right? You're talking about like monetary policy, right? That tends to get set at a more federal level.
Yeah.
There are certain state versions, which we'll cover shortly. But, at a federal level, you're talking about those big things, and that's where we start to get in conversations like negative gearing, capital gains concessions, things of that nature, right?
Yeah.
Or like the housing accords, right? Like government came out and said we want to build this amount of homes, so therefore, they're making certain contributions to help that. So that's helping the supply side, right? It's like the one comment I want to make about all levels of government is, for the most part, people should not stress about what they can't control, right? Like, we cannot control whether the government is going to abolish negative gearing. We cannot control if they're going to get rid of CGT discounts. We cannot control, if they're going to bring in a new certain, division property tax for property investors. We cannot control it. So we just have to make the best decisions with the information we have at hand today, right? So federal, that's where we typically see really big nationally based policies, right? Like the federal government doesn't tend to come in and say this state is going to be impacted by this. And that's why, tax concessions, monetary policy, certain, levels of planning, that's all federally based, right? And then you've also got other stuff like funding, right? Federal government could be funding, creation of new business parks or this or that, or contributing to it. And that obviously has a bit of an impact, and we'll talk about infrastructure shortly. But the federal government is like the really big hand type stuff, So I would say federal, really interesting, but it tends to have a much broader level of impact because it's going across on the whole, all Australians, right?
Yeah, and then at state level, you're starting to narrow in on that influence.
Definitely,
yeah,
and still obviously a macro factor, right? Micro is the property itself or the surrounding area. Getting into really fine details.
Yeah,
our states are all pretty big, so we're still talking macro.
Yeah, the state side of things, mate, is really, really interesting, and like these kind of policies that states put in place, they don't impact markets homogeneously, right? It's
definitely
like, for example, I think, with, the government grants that are out there, it's not going to, those kind of government grants for first home buyers, they're not going to impact all property markets the same way.
100%.
Right? It's more for those people that are kind of like on the lower side of the income.
Like lower socioeconomic status. Yeah.
So those
fringe
markets,
areas.
So those markets where it is more affordable are probably going to see more of a hit with those kind of
definitely
those kind of buyers, right?
Well, if I may,
I'll let you slot in.
You let me slot in. I completely agree, right? And I think that like the first home buyer concessions is a really good example because I'm not off the top of my head, I don't know the exact amount today of what like the maximum limit on property value is for the maximum concession, but whatever it is right now, it's not really too important for the dollar value. What is important though is that what you can get, what the concession maxes out at, you're not going to get a house in anywhere close to the center of Sydney with it.
Yeah.
Like you'd be lucky to get something on the outskirts of Sydney, right? And of course, some people say, well, first home buyers don't necessarily need to buy their first home as like their last home, and you can get an apartment and things like that to live in. And I completely agree, right? But I think going off your point about it doesn't impact homogeneously, and by that we mean equally, fairly across all people, is that if you want to live, if you want to live in the center of Sydney, you're not going to use that grant. So if it goes up by an extra $100,000, you're probably still not really going to care that much, right? But if you're living, say, in a rural area or a regional area, that grant might actually proportionally be a lot better. And now you're able to access it a lot more effectively. But if you're living in the inner suburbs of Sydney and then the state government in their election pledges decides to go, we're going to increase this by 5%.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to impact you that much,
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting one. I think the other one, if I may continue, Lukey, I could go all day on this stuff, man. You're like, I could as well, is things like taxes and levies and things like that. And I reckon there is no better example than the Vic government, right?
Oh, yes.
So
that's a can of worms.
It's a can of worms. I'll try and keep it brief so that we don't spend a whole episode talking smack about Victoria and the Victorian government. But I'm sure most people are aware that, there are some further limitations or impacts on owning property, especially investment properties in Victoria. And it's really interesting to see. And I'm certainly not going to say it's the only factor that was at play here, because I certainly have not gone to do the complete rigor of analysis that would be required to 100% confirm it was only this at play. But I would say that, logical deductions say it was a significant factor. The Victorian property market has just been decimated, right? Absolutely decimated. And it has been, I think, in large part due to some of the changes from the Vic government. So if we rewind to like the mid to late 2010s, the Victorian property market, generally speaking, was doing quite well. Like there's places that won't do well and there's places that will do it even better than well. But on a whole, it was performing at like not too bad of a pace, right? And then we ticked through all the way up to around COVID, and obviously we had that short little blip where everyone was freaking out about what was going to happen, and then as soon as things started to normalize, people went, okay, cool, and Victorian markets were doing really well. And then the Vic government brought in the first tranche of changes, which were what was like minimum standards in rental properties and tenancy rights and things like that. And I've said it on a bunch of podcasts, but I feel like, we're in a day and age where you've always got to clarify your comments. I'm not saying they were all bad, right? I'm not saying that, tenants shouldn't be protected. They should be, right? Like I rent, right? I want to make sure that I've got someone who's not taking advantage of me or things like that. But some of the changes started to add quite a burden into purchases, right? Like certain locks and this and heating that and this and that. And it just started to become, if you were buying a property, like you had to be really certain that it was up to the new standard to tenant, or you're going to have, in some cases, quite a big bill to fix it, right? So that was the first stage. Then they came in and then they adjusted their land tax. So from memory, they brought down the tax-free land threshold down to 50 grand of land value, which pretty much nothing falls under that. And then they started applying tax from above that, right? So people that previously didn't have any land tax may have been copping, a couple of $1,000s worth of land tax. And people that had, some holdings, but nothing crazy, might have been copping thousands more, right? So suddenly it became really unattractive. And then late last year, they also brought in even more tenancy reforms, which, again, continues to limit and restrict, the rights of an owner of the asset and things like that. So long story short, talking about government policy in terms of being a macro factor, the state government did nobody any favors down in Victoria. Yeah. All through their mismanagement of their own debt, and this isn't meant to be a soapbox, but their mismanagement of their state debt, and then trying to think of ways to claw that back, right? And they went and smashed property investors for it. Went and absolutely smashed them. When most are mum and dads that might own one investment property. Like we're not talking about, I don't know, Microsoft owning, or News Corp or something owning, hundreds of millions of dollars of property. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, mate, take a bit of a break. have a little bit of a rest. I know you're passionate about it.
The heart rate's is steaming after that.
Well, I think before we kind of sign off with infrastructure, the last one that we've got is looking at it at a local level.
Yeah.
And I think this is really, really interesting. And I think this is where, for those really, really savvy investors, where a lot of opportunity can lie when you understand this at a very intimate level.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts at
all right.
looking at this at a local level?
I'll keep myself in check with this one. No, look, I think we then bring it down to the local level, and I will say there does tend to be some chunks of overlap between local and state. Like obviously, local isn't going to go and impose taxes. However, a very topical story. People have seen what's just gone. I don't know if people are tracking what's just gone on over in the Manly area, but the local council has just voted to increase council rates by I think it was 40% or something. And it's because they have a significant amount of debt that's just not getting paid off.
I know that's happening with Crow's Nest as well.
Is it?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yep.
Near us. But goes to show, right? They can't go and impose a tax the same way, say, a state government can. But if things aren't handled properly, they can go and do things like your council rates, like they can get impact and stuff like that. So, but I think the biggest impact that we see from local councils is planning. Is the planning rules. So more often than not, the local governments, local councils will have all control, or if not all control, like the vast majority of control over the planning rules for the council that you're in. So
the zoning laws.
Exactly right. 100%.
Yeah.
So what that means is, especially when you're talking about control and supply of property, if a council's got very restrictive policies, it's going to be really hard to add supply, which if it's an attractive area to be and invest and live or whatever, that can send home values increasing further because there's no available supply. Conversely, if it's very loose, then that might impact it. But, if you don't have any empty land, and it relies on just like demolition of existing properties, it's probably not going to impact it that much, right?
Yeah.
But from a macro scale, it can fundamentally impact property values because even something as simple as zoning could impact why your property is worth more or less than your neighbor's property, or your friend's property 3 streets over. So local councils have a really massive role to play from a macro level because they can tangibly impact supply. They can, they can impact costs. They can impact demand too, through various measures. So but again, focus on what you can control. You can't change if they're going to change their zoning rules.
No, exactly right.
You can't control if out of nowhere they do a 40% increase in council rates. Like if you spend your whole life sweating about the small stuff and the stuff that you are never going to know about until it's too late, that you as an individual probably have no control over, God, you're going to have a rough life investing.
Yeah.
A really rough life.
But what are your, really quickly, because I know we need to move on, and before we actually get into infrastructure, we could probably quickly comment on...
We're running up on time here.
On the international political factors really quickly. But what about the opportunity for people that understand things at a local level very, very intimately, such as those zoning laws and stuff? What's your stance on that for people that are a bit more of that active type of investor?
For sure. Well, I think if you understand something like an expert, you can create some really cool scenarios, some really cool deals. But the thing is that everybody reckons they're an armchair expert, and there's obviously something very different about practically going to do it. Something very different about, I've got to go buy that property. I'm gonna have to settle on it. I'm doing it because I think I can do this. But if I can't, that ruins my whole plan, right? So when your money's on the line, it's very different. But I think if you can do it, that's great. But you can't fall You can't fall victim to your own bias of your knowledge, right? It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. I did a podcast on the Property Investment Australia podcast all about different biases and how they can impact you as an investor. One of the biggest ones is Dunning-Kruger, and the short version is the less you know about something, the more you often think you know. And that's why when you go and see people who really are experts in a field, they're usually the first ones to say oh, here's the answer. But just so you know, I don't know everything. I'm still learning myself. And it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I would highly recommend people look that up for themselves. Yeah.
Oh, interesting, mate.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So I guess, just to kind of tidy off the last point, which is the international political factors at play. So this is an interesting one. I think obviously, something that's very topical at the moment is what's going on over in the US with Trump and everything like that, and him talking about imposing, tariffs and whatnot. it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of impact that could potentially have
For sure.
on the Australian property market. Because, he's talking about imposing these tariffs on places like China, for example.
Well, he's done it. He did it.
Yeah?
He did it like 2 days ago.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it was 25% to China, 25% to Canada, 25% to Mexico.
Yeah. So even his neighbours, he doesn't care about.
Which the irony is, I'm pretty sure, because I was reading an article and I hope I read it right. Pretty sure he actually set up trade agreements between America, Canada, and Mexico.
Oh, right.
For effectively free trade. And in his first term, and now is come back and done it. So I'm sure there's obviously some good reasons that support it, but almost a little bit of irony there.
Yeah.
Mate, absolutely. And again, you can't even control what your local council does, let alone what another country does. But I think educated investors are smarter investors, and they tend to get better results. And I think the most important thing I'd say is just start to read and read the news and learn what's going on. For example, one of the biggest impacts that might come out of things like tariffs might be the impact it has on the dollar compared to the US dollar or other currencies around the world. And in turn, that then impacts other things. It might impact, the cost of goods that we get. It might impact the cost of resources like iron ore or things like that. If one country is getting hit, and then they export, like for example, China takes all of our iron ore, right? And I don't know enough about it, but if one of China's major exports to the US is then iron ore, and then they're going to get hit with a 25% tariff, how is that then going to impact what goes on with us?
Yeah.
Right. So it's just important, I think, just to read. You'd be surprised if you read the newspaper every day for a month. I think a lot of people would be surprised about how much they start to learn and pick up around global affairs, monetary policy, economic policy, political policy. So I think in terms of macro factors, don't overthink it, don't oversweat it, but just be aware of it.
Yeah.
Because you never know when some piece of information may become really important.
All right, well said. So
one more.
To round off,
how quick can we rip through it?
How are we going for time? How long are we?
Oh, I reckon we're at about 50 minutes. I reckon.
All righty. Well, let's pump this last one out. So infrastructure. So this is a really interesting one because infrastructure is one of those biggest. It's one of the biggest drivers of long-term property value movements, right? So
can be. I'll clarify. Say can be an impact. Yeah.
Yeah. So but again, not all infrastructure projects are going to impact markets in the same way.
Of course.
Right. And there's a couple of examples that we're going to speak about on this topic. So,
for sure.
But I guess before I kind of speak on that, what do you want to say on
massively? And I want to say, like, a lot of people out there, especially the more spruiker type property people or property companies, they're always going to bang on, especially, and I find house and land packages, right? There's a common sales tactic with it, always going on about, I've got all this infrastructure development, this infrastructure. It's like they can't say the word enough.
Yeah.
And infrastructure is obviously really important because it impacts the livability and desirability of an area, but it's not the only factor. And it's not, like I'm just thinking about buzzwords now, growth corridor, infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
It's by no means the only factor, and it's by no means sometimes even a primary factor, right? So what's really important for people to understand as well is that, like you said, firstly, infrastructure doesn't impact every project doesn't impact in the same way. And one project in one area, the same project in another area might have a completely different result.
Yep.
But I think the most important thing is that it takes time for the benefit of infrastructure to be realized in the context of property prices. And what I mean by that is, if you take like a brand new estate, like a house and land estate type of thing, right? Like you're building out a what's the word? Oh, like a master plan community kind of thing, right? So, it all gets announced and, they talk about, we're building out this new area, and obviously it's close enough to probably a highway because they need to be able to get in and out, but there's probably not much else around it, right? They start trying to sell off some of the lots in the place, and naturally you get people who probably live in the area that I can buy this brand new house, going to jump into it, and they start doing that, right? And they start to build it out, right? And let's say they do a year maybe of doing that sales process of the first few lots.
Yeah.
Then suddenly after a year or 18 months, they then start to put out those big announcements of some of the infrastructure or tenants that are going in the area, right? So they might start to go, all right, we've now got a Woolworths that's going to come in, and we're going to, do a bus depot or something here, or just some basic stuff, right?
A fuel station there is going to come in.
Yeah,
right? How long is it going to take to build that?
So
in the interim, they need to travel like 20, 30 minutes
100%,
to the nearest Woolies.
100%, right? So let's say that was 18 months, right? So let's say, obviously, Woolworths or these big people aren't stupid, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be saying, well, we need to make sure there's enough people there to support us putting something worth putting in, and something that is then going to probably be there for the next minimum 20, 30 years, if not, forever. Because funnily enough, I don't think I've ever seen a Woolworths close down,
Yeah.
But that aside, right? So let's say that they want to see another year, right? So they go, all right, 2.5, 3 years in, we'll start to actually begin building some of this infrastructure they said they were going to do, right?
Yeah.
So then let's say it now takes another, year and a half, 2 years for them to actually have it done, get it going, test it, make adjustments, whatever it is, right? So you're now at this point, like probably 5 years down the road, right?
Yeah.
And at this point, the community's maybe like a third built out anyway.
Yeah.
So first, people want to live places that make it convenient for themselves, and they want to make it so that they're around their friends and their family, so that basically you're in your own little ecosystem and bubble, right? So let's fast forward another year, right? And just say that we need more people living in the vicinity, right? So now we're up to around year 6, maybe year 6.5. People then start to tell their friends, oh, hey, like I'm living over in this place, like it's starting to, like, it's a bit of a vibe, like it's not bad, like we've still got to drive over here for the doctor, and we've still got to do this and that, but like you can see stuff's getting built, you can still get a house, like it's more expensive than we bought, but like, there's still half the community to go, you should jump in, right? And people go, oh, I don't know, like, we're now far from the kids' school, we got to do that, we just want to wait a bit, right? So let's say they go, all right, let's wait another 2 years, right? So I think I said I was up to either year 6 or 7, right? So now you're up to like year 8 or 9. And now those friends are still conversing, the family's still conversing. I go, you know what? Let's do it. Like, let's move in, right?
Yeah.
So now they probably spend a year-long journey of going, we've got to sell our current house, or we've got to start looking and finding what we want. Maybe it's got to get built, something like that.
Yeah.
So now you're talking about it's year 9 or 10 before you've even got, some sort of like consensus going of like people starting to move because their friends and family are there, right? And even then, it's still not fully developed, right? So you're talking like 10 to 15 years before you start to really get a critical mass of people that are going, I want to be there because my life is easier, my friends are there, my family's there, other people have moved in and all that. And it's really important because you don't want to live places that don't have that infrastructure. Yeah. But imagine if you invested right at the start of this project, or year 2 or 3, and you're waiting 7 years to even get to the 10-year mark before you may start to feel some of that, and I put in inverted commas, benefit of having all this infrastructure,
I think, like, there's obviously anomalies to every situation as well. Of course. Like, I think a classic one for people that know Sydney pretty well, like Marsden Park, for example, when that was getting built. Like, property prices grew there pretty quickly, but it was different. It wasn't kind of like it was just on the outskirts, right? It had everything kind of already.
And that's the difference.
Yeah. Like, but I think another really good example of how infrastructure doesn't really impact certain property markets is what's been going on in like Bella Vista.
Yeah.
Right?
In Sydney, Bella Vista.
Yeah. So obviously the Metro came in, I think it was around like 2019 that they kind of signed off on that one in Bella Vista. But Bella Vista, as you would know, is quite, an affluent area.
Yeah.
And
it's grown that way. It didn't used to be, but it's certainly grown that way for sure.
Like 15, 20 years ago, it was like cow paddocks and whatnot.
Exactly right.
But it's certainly now a very, very affluent area.
Yeah.
But with the Metro coming in, although hundreds of millions, if not maybe billions of dollars was spent on that, it's not actually moving the needle that much with the Bella Vista market. And the reason for that is a lot of people that live there drive everywhere.
Because it's so far away from the city and from a bunch of other stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly right. So just because a massive project like that has come in to improve accessibility and transportation for the greater suburbs surrounding doesn't mean that specific markets don't flourish as well.
Absolutely. Right? And I think that's where it's so important to understand demographics and things like that, because I couldn't agree more. But you go and look at somewhere like, we'll use somewhere local to where we're recording, Crow's Nest in Sydney. That the Chatswood to Sydenham Metro line opened towards the end of last year.
Yeah.
And it was a game changer, right? And I think a lot of that, and I'm not certainly sitting here saying anything about property price or how it's impacted, but just thinking about how it has been perceived and received by the community is that there's a lot of apartments around this area. There's a lot of people who wouldn't have cars. There's a lot of people who might be young or professionals. A lot of people who work close enough, but not walking distance from shops or their workplaces or the city or things like that. It's likely to have a far greater impact than, like you were saying with the example with Bella Vista, because most people have cars. Most people have big family homes with 2 or 3 cars. Quite a few kids.
Yeah,
and they're not going to hang out in the city. Like maybe they go there for work, but they're not going to hang out on a weekend in the city, or things like that. And if they're going other places, they'll probably drive, because it's more convenient, it's easier.
No, exactly right.
Things like that. So I think what you said right at the start is so true. Different projects are going to impact places differently, similar projects are going to impact different areas in different ways. And infrastructure in and of itself is not, some second coming of property prices. It's not the surge or anything like that. It's one factor in a very big cog.
Yeah. No, good stuff, mate. I think we've done well. How are we going? Well. I think we're close to the hour mark.
We're going to fall under the hour. It's so hard though, because I feel like we do it once a month. Yeah. We've always got so much to say.
No, we do.
We always want to have a really good chat so that people get value, since we're not back on the airwaves for another 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So, but mate, look, I think if you're happy, I'll round us out.
Yeah, round us out. Give the voice box the rest, mate.
So, thanks everyone for tuning in. We really hope that you're enjoying what we're talking about. We've still got a ton of great content and episodes to come. And most importantly, especially with everything we've been talking about today, if you have been thinking about starting or building your property portfolio, you need to come and have a chat with myself and the team at Atlas Property Group, right? We will be able to help you plan your portfolio over the next 10, 15, 20 years, help you understand how you can set up a better retirement. We're doing a lot of stuff in self-managed super funds as well at the moment, right? A lot of people who might not be able to invest in their personal names are coming through because they've got good funds in their super and they think that they can do something better with it. But it's important you always talk to your appropriate advisors about that as well. But come and have a chat with us, because we would absolutely love to help you, especially before the market gets crazier and crazier and you miss that awesome chance to get in now before that, as Luke put it, that sugar hit of the sentiment changing. So until then, thank you for tuning in, and you can find us on atlaspropertygroup.com.au.
Thanks for listening, guys.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.